14th day, middle wind month, 1 CE, tilapia. Fresh tiger tilapia from Crystal Lake. Bamboo baskets. Canes of all lengths. Liana. Jute ropes. Straw and thatch. Ilishnish adjusted the yellow rawhide band wrapped snugly around her wrist as she and her companions wove their way through the crowded river market. Thus far, no one had tried to eat her while she was wearing it, so it appeared to be working as advertised. The press of beastmen was stifling, however, and she regretted taking what she had thought would be the most interesting route. Not that it wasn't interesting. The sights and sounds were new and exotic, but the crowds of predatory demi-humans weren't to her tastes. There was also the fact that Vltava was draped over her left shoulder like some sort of fluffy pauldron. Another annoying thing was that a small crowd of smaller beastmen followed in her wake, using her as an easy way to get through the market. What would happen if she stopped? Would they get mad? Would they all stop and wait for her, staring at her back until she kept moving? In a dark corner of her mind, disquieting fears lurked over whether they were simply gathering insufficient force to take her down like winter wolves loitering around a nook. "Where are you taking us, Seeker?" Her ear twitched as Vltava bleated into it. I don't know. Ilishnish replied, "I just wanted to look around." "That's what I'm here to do." They were barely 2 kilometers from the Kuroko's cliffs, but she was already feeling overwhelmed. There were too many unfamiliar things going on around her and far too many people. When she couldn't take it anymore, she leapt out of the crowd, landing on the escarpment overlooking the main thoroughfare. How do these people live like this? She glared down at the crowded market. Is the warden considering doing anything similar in her territory? Pebble asked. I hope not, Ilishnish said. It's not her style, either. This is just a bunch of people crammed together because there's work to be had. I bet they don't even know why this city is here in the first place. Would anything change if they knew? I doubt it. The locals don't appear to understand why this city was founded here, but that doesn't matter now. They're like a giant collection of carnivores that have found a mysteriously convenient feeding ground. She wasn't certain about the natives of Rolengork, but humans supposedly built urban centers in locations of strategic, economic and political importance. Ilishnish, however, was of the mind that this was thinking for big decision-makers. She doubted the little people cared beyond the fact that work and thus necessities could be obtained. Once they were there, more goods and services would come to them and the denizens of the city would work toward their respective goals. The only way that would change was if it wasn't worth doing, but Khorst-Horrific-Aral was evidently entrenched. I wonder if the entire world is like this, Ilishnish said. Like what? Pinecone asked. People dwelling amongst the ruins of past ages, she answered. Like a sad echo of a past long forgotten. The humans are like this too, you know? Except that their heedless rush for industry and progress only serves to bury their past even faster. By the way, do you know what happened to this region? That whole demon gods thing, I mean. We know what happened, Pinecone said, but not why. Ours is the perspective of distant observers, uninvolved in the affairs of those beyond our mountain homes. Ilishnish had also asked her mother about the events of 2 centuries previous, but she and the other frost dragons present at the time wisely vacated the Azalisia Mountains and spent the next decade in the frozen expanse. The few who decided to return found the ordeal over and the realities of those who remained overturned and shattered. Their traditional rivals, the frost giants, had stood their ground in a characteristically frost giant way and suffered great losses in the process. However, it appeared that the southern clans had successfully turned the demon god's assault, causing the mysterious entities to divert and go after the dwarves instead. The mountain dwarves lost their capital and were transformed from a long-standing fixture of the region to a crippled and slowly declining remnant. Around the Azalisia Mountains, the human-populated lands had been razed to the ground and everyone else didn't fare much better. They wreaked havoc on the region, Ilishnish half said to herself, but they weren't strong enough to wipe out the frost giants. I don't think these demon gods would have succeeded in the present day. Possibly not, Vltava said. Certainly not with the same degree of success. Dragonkind would have recovered in its new form, and every ancient dragon's domain invaded would carry with it the risk of loss. His words matched what Mitra had shared with her, adding to the idea that the timing of their appearance was suspiciously convenient. Then again, it happened because it could, so it might have just been her. One never called a successful ambush suspiciously convenient, They happened because opportunities presented themselves. Do you know what they were? Ilishnish asked. An echo of the calamities that regularly visit the world, perhaps. The form tends to vary, but the timing was the same. Did they come to you? No. Awareness is required to be targeted. It wasn't a bad way to go about doing things. If one didn't draw attention to oneself and stayed beyond the awareness of beings of cataclysmic power, it saved a lot of trouble. Then why did you reveal yourself to the Warden? Because the cataclysm of this cycle probably cannot be avoided, Vltava replied. Furthermore, it comes at a strength comparable to the most devastating cataclysms of the past. Better to seek shelter than risk suffering the whims of uncaring beings. Minding one's business isn't an option, huh? No. We witnessed what the evil star wrought. It was a malevolent, unstoppable force that sought the suffering and destruction of all. Calamities often do not come as single events within a small region, so we suspect that others are happening elsewhere. Some may even sweep over the entire world. Wait, Ilishnish said, so you didn't stop because of the Warden? We did, but all things have a purpose, and all things are connected. Right. They left their observation of the market, heading deeper into the trees away from the river. After a few minutes of following the winding woodland trails, Vltava abruptly reached out and yanked her whiskers. Oh, ow, 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 ow. Ilishnish cried, why? This way. Vltava gave her whiskers another tug. You could have just said something. She wriggled her muzzle, then turned to Pebble and Pinecone. Does he do this to you, too? No, Pebble replied. No, replied Pinecone. Ilishnish released a sigh. She had no idea what whiskers were in her natural appearance, and she didn't want to find out what she would lose if Vltava tugged them out. A few tugs later, they arrived at the base of an extraordinarily large tree. Oh, I saw this tree and others like it on the flight the other night, Ilishnish said. Lady Zaradnik was furious when she saw them. A nature spirit from a past age, Vltava said. Their voices have long grown distant, but their duties remain. This one has been violently relieved of them. Something like a dryad before dryads were dryads? She tried to imagine what the tree looked like while it was still alive, but she had never seen the like before. All that she was left with after the exercise was the somber idea that some experiences were forever lost to her. Vltava squirmed his way off of her shoulder, landing lightly on the forest floor. They followed him as he made his way between the tree's canyon-like roots, sniffing at his surroundings along the way. There is no replacement for this one, he said. No new manifestation tends to this land. This was no accident or natural occurrence, it was done on purpose. The Warden was right to be furious. How can there be no replacement? Ilishnish looked up at the colossal stump. This jungle is full of life. The land still recoils from the events of the past, Vltava said. Life abounds, yet memory remains. There are scars both visible and invisible here. A roar swelled over the broken edges of the stump, filled with excitement and bloodlust. It appeared that something else was suppressing things aside from the scars of the past. Vltava scaled the sheer trunk, rapidly making his way to the top in a continuous series of hops. Pebble and Pinecone followed. Ilishnish looked to see if anyone had noticed them before doing the same. On the other side was one of the arena-like structures carved out of the ancient tree's interiors. The stands were nearly full and the spectators lavished their savage approval of the spectacle on bloodied sands below. Ilishnish took an inventory of the crowd. The sense of placement was oddly similar to the grand arena in our winter, with the most disreputable spectators filling the pit immediately surrounding the combat area. Elevated platforms were spaced evenly around the arena and were occupied by well-to-do-looking beastmen. According to Nemel, who didn't much like the grand arena, many of the Empire's elite attended when high-profile matches were scheduled. Indeed, the fervor of the crowd indicated just that, except the beastmen elites in their exclusive seating appeared to be observing the matches with deadly seriousness. Nemel said that most nobles enjoyed arena matches just as much as everyone else, so she wondered what was the source of the odd behavior. Vltava didn't seem interested at all in the proceedings, continuing to sniff his way around the top of the ancient stump. Another cheer rolled over them. Ilishnish shook her head, wondering what the point of the fighting was. As she understood it, the competitors could win something, but it didn't explain why people came to watch. Nemel said that tickets were expensive, too. Wait, does that mean I have to pay to be up here? Elishnish lowered her profile, trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. She looked over to where Pebble and Pinecone followed Vltava as he slowly made his way along. She hoped that no one noticed them. She didn't want to lose any of her precious coins for something they weren't even paying attention to. After a nerve-wracking hour atop the edge of the tree stump, Vltava seemed satisfied with his findings and returned to the jungle floor. Elishnish breathed a sigh of relief when no one came chasing after them demanding payment. "What did you find?" she asked. "Nothing," Vltava said. "Not even the slightest sense of what came before." "Well, there was the stump. It is no longer what it once was." "What did you hope to find?" "A memory, or perhaps an attempt to retain memory. But there is no memorial to the bastion of life that once stood here. There is no one who remembers." "The mystics of this city seem to possess traces of memory," Elishnish offered. "There's another tree like this that has been turned into something like a temple." Vltava hopped back onto her shoulder. "Take us there." "What am I, a soul eater?" It felt pointless to voice her thoughts. On the plus side, Vltava would stay high and out of trouble where he was. The people and their dwellings grew more sparse as they headed south over the low ridge dividing one river from the next. Unlike human cities, where more space usually indicated one had entered a wealthier district, here, it signified that they had entered one of Khorstarifikeral's many ranching areas. As they went along, herds of Anug could occasionally be seen grazing between the trees under the watchful eye of their beastman tenders. "Lady Zaradnik mentioned that there are Nook in the southern border ranges," Elishnish said. "Have you ever considered doing something like this?" "No," Pebble said. "There is no need. By keeping a hunting range free of predators, the herds take care of themselves." "That's true." Elishnish bobbed her head in greeting as they passed a pair of Gao ranchers. "In that case, what are these beastmen doing? Keeping thieves away?" "In part," Pebble said. "They are also forcing a result. Enforcing set patterns of migration and breeding. Providing what is otherwise unobtainable. It is happening all over this basin, and it is unsustainable and all too easy to collapse. If calamity revisits them, the vast majority of their population will perish from starvation and their civilization will be buried by chaos once again." Elishnish nodded in agreement. To maximize their ranching efforts, the beastmen actively hunted or drove away all grazers that competed with their Nug for fodder and any potential predators. Rather than the wild jungle that outsiders might believe Rolling Gorp to be, it was in reality not much different from the rolling pastures east and northeast of Urantal. "I wonder how long until something befalls them," Elishnish mused. "Many vulnerabilities already exist," Pinecone said. "They are importing what their lands are deficient in. Reliance on a limited number of species also creates susceptibility to disease. One that cannot be cured will inevitably enter this system and bring about its end. Shouldn't their druids and rangers be advising them about this? I know that the humans tend to ignore theirs, but they're highly integrated into this society." That being said, their druids were considered mystics and filled the shamanistic roles that existed in many tribal societies. Still, they should have had the insights into nature and its workings that druids were known for. "It is not easy for many," Pebble said. "Young civilizations find advantages and tend to exploit them without thought. They see what is good for their own kind and do not consider the greater consequences, or ignore them in pursuit of growth. I think frost dragons would not understand this, as they do not care for kin as many other species do." Elishnish flicked her ear in agreement. Frost dragons propagated their numbers, but it was extraordinarily rare for them to nurture and protect their young. Even if they did, they had absolutely no qualms about driving away or killing a mate, sibling or child if necessary. Overpopulation was never an issue, thus they never needed to devise methods to support it. If anything, frost dragons did the opposite of what many races did, ensuring that their domains remained diverse and healthy. As they walked down the other side of the ridge, they left the ranchland and entered the next urban district of the city. Rather than a single city, the Khorstarifiker'al might have been better described as a cluster of urban centers. Each was the size of a small human city, with residences, markets and simple industries clustered around the clan holds in the hills above the valleys or around the stumps of the colossal trees. There was also a strip of urban area along the lakefront where the many wharves were, which was where humans would have probably built a city. Overall, it was a curious layout that supported what she had noted before. Something had decided that the beastmen were to live in those locations, and then sheer inertia kept them there. The when and why of everything were forgotten. The ruins of Shork's clanhold and others like it might have drawn a population that survived the demon gods back like an old, familiar lair. Aside from that, the only other clue Elishnish had was the odd name of the city. Shimmering Crystal Palace of the Water Spirits. She hadn't seen anything that resembled a water spirit. Nor did she note any crystal palaces in the area. The closest thing to crystal that the locals used were gemstones and the bits and pieces of volcanic glass that they found on the ground. The colossal tree that was their next destination was just as large and just as dead. Like the arena tree from before, its roots served as ramps that led to tunnels bored into the ancient trunk. A few of the local Irma population walked to and from the entrance, but, as before, Vltava made his own way up the stump as he investigated the ancient tree's remains. Because the temple tree hadn't been carved out into a bull as the arena tree had, Vltava ended up popping up in front of an Irma mystic near the edge of the stump. The mystic leapt up onto the table beside her, eyes wide and fur raised. The supplicants she was seeing too were similarly shocked. Elishnish finished scaling the trunk and scooped Vltava up in her paws. "Good morning," she said. "Our apologies for the interruption." She walked away before the mystic could reply. The temple was an open-air venue with daises raised around its perimeter. Each dais was attended to by 1 or 2 mystics and a small crowd of supplicants awaited service. Most of them showed signs of being sick or wounded. Many carried various goods, placing them before the mystics when it came their turn. Tributes? Or payment? The temples in the Sorceress Kingdom and the Empire had a similar system where coins were offered in exchange for healing. She had never seen humans come with nothing, neither had she seen them offer food, cloth or other things. "Is there something I can help you with?" Elishnish looked down at the voice. Another Irma, this time an elderly male with a black mane, looked up tentatively at her. A younger male stared up at her beside him. She wasn't waiting for service, yet the other beastmen who arrived ahead of her had cleared a way for her to the nearest altar and she had thoughtlessly followed it. "What should I do?" She glanced down at the fluffy disaster in her hands. After a moment's thought, she placed him on the altar as the other beastman supplicants had. "This is..." The 2 Irma mystics leaned forward curiously. "This one has a question for you," Vltava bleated. With startled shouts, the 2 mystics jumped back. "The beast," the elder exclaimed, "it speaks." Says the beastman. Vltava's central eye returned an unamused look. This one would know how this tree came to its end. "This tree?" The elder scratched his head. "Do you mean the stump we're standing on? It's been like this for as long as anyone can recall." "How long?" Vltava pressed the elder. Anything I heard about this tree was from the time I was a cub. From my elders, who were born 6 generations ago. The tree was like this when the survivors of the demon gods returned to their old homes. The entire city was burned to ashes except for the ancient trees, which were felled. None who bore witness to the destruction lived. "You said the whole city," Elishnish said. "But was it the same city? The name of this place does not match its appearance. You say that no witnesses survived, but did any who fled remember what the city was like before?" I don't know." "Then, were there any relics recovered from the ashes?" "Surely, the mystics of that time endeavored to preserve what they could upon their return." The 2 Irma only replied with unknowing looks. It seemed that Mitra's assessment was on the mark, but how was that possible? It was one thing to damage a city to the degree that it would be considered destroyed, but it was another to remove almost every tangible trace of the past. According to the regional histories, there were multiple demon gods. But there wasn't an army of them. Elishnish was fairly confident that she could destroy most of the cities she had seen so far, but personally burning every book, defacing every carving and melting every plaque would take an annoyingly long time. "Is that all you require?" the elder asked. Elishnish reached down and picked up Vltava. "It is," she said. "Since you weren't able to answer to our satisfaction, however, you don't get to have him." They left the temple, this time going down the main ramp and leaving out of one of the entryways before following the river downstream to return to the Kuroko's cliffs from a different direction. An 8-kilometer stroll brought them to the lake, right to one of the many wharves of the city. They crossed what could only be described as a band of slums running parallel to the waterfront. The slums in the Empire rarely had anything interesting in them, so she swiftly made her way through to the crowded markets lining the piers. Once again, they were treated like rangers blazing a trail through the urban jungle by the smaller residents. Elishnish was now too preoccupied with her task for the Ministry of Transportation to pay them any mind, however. River infrastructure in Rolengork bore an uncanny resemblance to the infrastructure in the Draconic Kingdom. It was the only aspect of the tribal confederation that might be considered well developed by human standards. Elishnish wasn't sure if there was any significance to that, as, in the end, both humans and beastmen were terrestrial species. Both used ships for the same purposes, and the facilities that serviced them would by necessity be similar. The dimensions of the two civilizations' river barges were also identical, aside from the fact that the Draconic Kingdom usually employed sails while Rolengork usually used paddle wheels. It was as if some shared standard bound both countries, or perhaps it was something that one side copied from the other over the course of their long relationship. She watched as one such vessel paddled its way slowly alongside the pier. A team of Nardok workers caught the lines cast toward them and secured the ship to its moorings. As it was in the Empire and the Draconic Kingdom, its cargo was stored in sacks and crates which were individually offloaded by menial labor. Elishnish watched the entire process, hoping that what she observed would be useful to the Sorceress Kingdom's Ministry of Transportation upon recollection. "Are there no demi-humans in these waters?" Pinecone asked. Elishnish considered the question for a moment. The effluent from the city should have provoked some reaction from the lake's demi-human population, but she had neither seen nor heard of any aquatic demi-humans or heteromorphs dwelling in Rolengork. Aquatic species have limited space to flee in such environs, Vltava said. It is likely that they were wiped out. "I'll find out for sure later," Elishnish said. "For now, I need to gather enough information to not get skinned." "Is it just the skin, or will they use every part?" Shut up. I don't want to know." The matter-of-fact pragmatism of the short-lived herbivore was admirable, for a short-lived herbivore. Despite being strong, their lives were brief, so they prioritized the long-term strength and survival of their society and turned communication and the passing down of their collective knowledge into an art. Their ways were not something that dragons would ever consider for themselves. As a bard, however, she had developed a healthy appreciation for them. This one heard from the dark elf called Aura that they processed and stored every part of the one called the Frost Dragon low. "La la 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 la, I can't hear you. This one is right on your shoulder." She considered hurling Vltava into the lake, but he could fly. Drowning him probably wouldn't work, either. Over the next few hours, Elishnish slowly made her way north along the wharves of Kkorstorofi. After the third or fourth wharf, she grew tired of being stared at and chose to instead stealthily observe things from the shadows of the narrow alleys in the nearby slums. The shoddy construction of the structures around her allowed her blind sight to see perfectly through everything. Mama. Much of what went on, however, did not require blind sight to perceive. Mama. Vltava hopped off of her shoulder and trotted off after the sound of the nearby voice. Since it wasn't coming from very far away, Elishnish stayed where she was to observe the nearby market. "Don't eat her," Elishnish called after the Kronos druid absently. "Someone might charge you for poaching." Whether Vltava heard her or not, she couldn't tell, and he certainly didn't pay her any mind if he did. A few minutes later, he came back with a lup pup, not much more than an infant, with its jaws firmly latched onto his leg. "You're not keeping that," Elishnish said. "It was a test," Vltava replied. "What sort of test involves getting one's leg chewed on?" "The young are often left in their dens until they can assist their parents with their work. There is not much opportunity to observe individuals of this age." Elishnish was out killing and eating things mere seconds after hatching, so she couldn't relate. How did other species survive with such crippling dependencies? "Most parents become alarmed or enraged when they find their young with strangers like this," she said. "This collection of hovels won't survive one of your tornadoes." She narrowed her eyes and growled at the pup. It released its hold and soiled itself. "Ugh, gross." After some poking and prodding, Vltava put the lup pup back where it came from. Elishnish used a trooper's towel to eliminate any trace of their passing, but the effect was too strong and cleaned the entire cramped hovel instead. "Is there an item that produces the opposite effect?" "There must be." She threw some dirt on the pup before they left. "That would have to do." As they left the slum to return to the wharves, her gaze went out over the erratic expanse of stone dens, wooden shacks and tents lining the jungle alleys under the shade of the trees along the shore. After several moments, her attention went to the vast lake that stretched beyond the horizon. "I suppose we'll have to find out what happened the hard way," Elishnish said. "Or maybe it's the easy way, considering how clueless the locals are." From the sky, many patterns that wouldn't be noticed from the ground were apparent. Strangely, the demon gods, some of whom supposedly flew, left that evidence behind. It was an obvious thing that they should have erased considering how thorough they otherwise were. That investigation, however, would have to wait. It would probably take days, and she had more dancing lessons with Mitra slated for the afternoon. They're back. Soraka looked up from where several humans were installing a simple crane. The parts to the device were recently manufactured by the artisans working for Shork, and the first would be used to lift stone blocks out of their slowly expanding quarry. Nearby, a few Osalo were being instructed on its operation by one of the human masons. So far, things were going well between Shork's new slaves and the Clanhold's residents. A part of it was probably because the humans were still very much a curiosity. Another contributing factor was Shork's slowly growing influence around her home, which was already a thing before she came under his care and would continue to expand. Mostly, however, Soraka was certain it was because the humans had been instructed on proper conduct around Felid beastmen on the journey to the capital. Understanding that all species had a nature unique to them and being aware of how one's presence and actions influenced others was integral to being a member of a civilized, multiracial society. In the Draconic Kingdom, and, presumably, the rest of the region, humans mostly lived as a monoracial culture and their behaviors were unsurprisingly ill-suited for civilized lands. That behavior fed into the neighboring beastmen's behavior, which was similarly unrefined, resulting in a relationship befitting that of primal tribes despite appearances. Fortunately, that behavior could be addressed, and the humans were especially cooperative considering where they were headed. None of them wished to be pounced upon, chased or otherwise treated as prey. Of course, some picked up what was necessary quicker than others, but those who were still having trouble adapting could do so from the safety of their little artisan enclave on the second terrace. Jiraka took one last look down the cliff before returning to Soraka's side. The first to appear at the top of the ramp was Viltava, whom Soraka wasn't sure worked as a good model for the humans to follow. When asked for his take on interspecies relations, he simply said, "If you do not wish to be prey, then don't be." This was actually the correct take, but Soraka was certain that the humans couldn't figure things out from just that, never mind emulating Viltava's attitude. Despite his supremely edible appearance, the diminutive druid was utterly unflappable. Even dragons would probably be bullied by him. The trio of Felid Kronos followed shortly after. He grew weary inside when Winter Moon came into view, despite her being nothing but pleasing to look upon. Exceptionally strong individuals were not only candidates for harems in the Beastman Confederacy, but nearly everywhere for species capable of those relations. In a world where stark differences in strength meant that singularly powerful individuals could shatter the balance of power and destroy centuries of development on a whim, prudent tribes, clans and countries sought to breed and cultivate the strength to keep enemies and rogue factors alike in check. Some groups were blessed with exceptionally powerful bloodlines, producing veritable gods that guaranteed their sovereignty. Others were not so lucky and sought the strong beyond their borders. While the Beastmen Confederacy did have thousands of strong pedigrees, they still sought more abroad. It would be negligent not to do so. Wealth and prestige, rights and authority, those with the means did everything that they could to secure the strong. Even so, not everyone was interested in what was offered and would not cooperate. The response to those individuals within a country was varied, but most simply killed them off as they were an unacceptable risk if left to their own devices. How often this happened depended on a nation's approach to ensuring that those with strength and talent worked for them in some way. Additionally, some were too strong to deal with, but it was difficult to become that powerful without being noticed along the way. Those who did cooperate were usually left with want for little, but they also had the good sense to understand that individualistic goals paled in importance to the survival of their civilization and species. As for Soraka, he had mostly escaped from any unpleasantness due to the nature of both his professional duties and a fair bit of luck with his current wives. Now, it seemed that his luck had finally run out. Mitra was still investigating Winter Moon's true strength, but it was already clear that she qualified for his harem. At some point, he would have to take the initiative, which was odd. Candidates usually flung themselves, often bodily, at him, but Wintermoon showed absolutely no interest. He preferred to respect the members of his harem and the independent lives that they led, so the prospect of courting someone who wasn't interested in him at all left a bad taste in his mouth. Wintermoon went by, and he couldn't contain his curiosity at a strange detail. "Why are you wearing that?" he asked. She stopped at his question, following Soraka's gesture to the yellow band around her wrist. "Is this not to indicate that one is not to be consumed?" "That's right." "Well, I do not wish to be consumed. If that is my wish, then I should use this, yes?" "That's technically correct." Vltava might have been targeted, but it was impossible to imagine that Wintermoon would be. Her sheer size alone would give nearly anyone second thoughts, and the highly instinctive behavior of Rolengork's denizens essentially guaranteed that flight would take precedence over fight so long as they felt that they could avoid a confrontation with her. Beyond that, she was strong. Through their practicing together, Mitra estimated that Wintermoon was halfway to Atarati. In other words, she was strong enough to single-handedly wreak havoc upon a weak country that had no external allies, much like an elder dragon might. Very few were that strong. In Rolengork, they encountered no locals who were even half that strength. "Would you happen to know where Mitra is?" Wintermoon asked. "We were supposed to be doing something this afternoon." "She and the others were going around the Clanhold's lower terrace with Shulk," Soraka replied. "There's a small procession with them, so they'll be hard to miss." "Thank you." Wintermoon and her companions continued on their way. After the last of their long tails disappeared beyond the curve of the worn lane, Jaraka nudged Soraka with his elbow. "You sure about that?" he asked. "Sure about what?" "She's a candidate, right? Even if the harem thing doesn't work out, they'll still want her strength back home. You're not even trying." "Normally," Soraka muttered, "I wouldn't even need to try." "I'll give you that," Jaraka conceded, "but don't you think she's attractive?" "That's hardly the point of a harem," Soraka said. "Even in a normal situation, going after her is backwards." Securing harem candidates abroad was harder than most people believed. First and foremost, males were at a disadvantage as foreigners. Female Felid beastmen tended to have control over matters of breeding. They only went into heat once a year at most, and they weren't about to tell random strangers when that was. As such, they quietly did all of the sizing up, comparing potential mates that came into their awareness. Since his main duties involved him never staying in one place for long, it was essentially a matter of luck. A female had to be interested in him, which, admittedly, wasn't usually an obstacle, but he also had to be around when she was in heat. Even if they were interested in him, they didn't necessarily want to leave their homes or give up their children. In the world beyond the Confederacy, most weren't accustomed to highly mobile, cosmopolitan lifestyles where a female could plan well in advance to meet with a male of her choosing. Soraka furrowed his brow as his thoughts led him to stranger places. "Actually," he said, "how does that work here?" "How does what work?" Jaraka yawned. "Breeding." "Why is the guy with the harem asking that question?" "No, I mean, the people here mostly act on instinct and they don't have any of our magical conveniences. How is this place not constant chaos every time a girl goes into heat and attracts every guy within a 2-kilometer radius?" "Ah." Jaraka's face slowly shifted into a rare expression of befuddlement. "See what I mean?" Soraka said. "Well," Jaraka crossed his arms. "I haven't smelled that happening yet. We've been in Rolengork for months, too. Our girls have stuff for it, but I don't think they have the same stuff here. You should go investigate. City work is your forte, right?" "I don't get paid enough for this." "Paid enough for what?" Soraka and Jaraka started, turning to find Kasturi walking up behind them. The rest of Mitra's party was further behind on the opposite side of the expanding quarry. "Nothing," Jaraka mumbled and looked away. "It didn't sound like nothing to me," Kasturi said. "Damn scouts and their absurd hearing." "Maybe you already know the answer," Soraka decided to confront the question head-on. "What happens when females go into heat?" Kasturi gave him a long, flat look. Then she turned around and vanished from his sight. Soraka's head swiveled about as he tried to figure out where she went. "You're dead," Jaraka said. She's going straight back to your wives. Kasturi reappeared in front of Mitra. After a brief exchange, her entire party looked in his direction. They slowly stalked over, probably on purpose. Mitra hopped over the quarry to land before him. It was a purely academic question, Soraka said. Sure it was, Mitra peered at him. Jiraka, make sure he doesn't do anything he isn't supposed to. Your servant obeys, Yuvarani. Don't you work for me? Soraka narrowed his eyes at the Inquisitor. Like I said, Jiraka answered, I don't get paid enough for this. Soraka sighed. His gaze traveled across his plainly unamused wives before landing on Shulk. Shulk, how do? Nope. Mitra planted her paws on her hips. But. Nope. Don't tell him, Shulk. That information is too dangerous for him to know. Shulk, who was hiding behind Mitra's arm, nodded empathetically. Just what the hell do they do? Their adamant insistence on keeping the answer from him only served to make him more curious. Wintermoon came back just now, Jiraka said. Oh good, the Sharon said. We're so close to figuring out the thingy, I just know it. You just missed her, Soraka said. I told them that you were going around this terrace and they went looking for you. What did they do out in the city? I didn't ask. Mitra gave him an odd look. Not you, too. Usually, his wives were very protective, warding away any females who came onto him. Mitra's excitement over finding a fellow dancer of rare caliber had probably overridden that behavior. Unfortunately, Wintermoon seemed outwardly oblivious to what was going on. There you are. A voice came from the ramp leading from the inn. It wasn't exactly new, Soraka was sure he had heard it somewhere before. Shulk. The Osalo whom they had first seen Shulk with below the arena jogged up to them. What's wrong, Kaimali? Shulk asked. I haven't seen you at the fighting pits for weeks, Kaimali answered, then seemed to realize the rest of them were there. Oh, did they come for you already? Shulk went rigid. Soraka scrutinized the youth. So he's not here because he was worried about her being away for so long? Then again, Itzli would have said something if he had asked after her while she was out of the city. See, come for me? Shulk failed to contain her wariness. What do you mean? Soraka glanced at the masons in the pit. The newcomer was preoccupied with Shulk, so he hadn't noticed them yet. Soraka stepped forward, filling the Osalo's vision. The youth stared up at him, shrinking in on himself and taking a step back. What have you done? Soraka demanded. The youth lowered his head. Some warriors from Clan Kira came with me, good lord. They're down at the river. Clan Kira? Shulk grew panicked. Why would one of the great clans come for me? We can talk on the way down. Soraka stepped forward again, pressuring the youth back down the ramp. Get these humans to the upper terrace, just in case. A pair of his escorts went to carry out his orders. Shulk fidgeted nervously as they descended to the waterfront. Why are they here for me? She asked. Am I in trouble? No, not at all. Kaimali replied. The great clans have come to the city. They've been spectating in the fighting pits, looking for mighty warriors. I'm not exactly a mighty warrior. Don't sell yourself short, Shulk, Kaimali said. The warrior clans will recognize a true warrior when they see one. I told them about your moves and they immediately asked to meet you. This is your big chance. Her big chance is already here. Soraka glowered at Kaimali's back. Clan Kira wasn't trying to make up for its recent loss in fighting power, was it? He empathized with their situation, but what Shulk was doing in Khostorfi Keral was far more important for Rolengork as a whole. Even with what was going on the Yorgulan front, it would take generations for the Yorgulans to make substantial gains against Rolengork. Tribal states only advanced as far as they needed to, slowly expanding their borders through steady competitive pressure. Their green dragon masters were not much different, as dragons tended to stick to their domains and those domains very slowly grew as the dragons did. Younger dragons striking out from their parents' domains would find it hard to settle in Rolengork with dragon slayers constantly on the prowl for them. With luck, it would be enough time for Shulk to build a foundation upon which she could begin to change Rolengork's situation. At the same time, the Beastman Confederacy's sphere of influence would have expanded westward. What Rolengork needed was not to stubbornly throw bodies at their growing problem in the east, but to pursue domestic development to the extent that the Confederacy saw fit to intervene on their behalf. When that happened, the Green Dragons would have no chance. Outside the front of the inn, they found a pair of bar watching the river. The two turned at the approach of Soraka's party, and their expressions shifted. "You're Soraka, aren't you?" Both of the awaiting bar were members of Rana Saj's warband and had accompanied the bar lord through the fighting in the east. "Most of the time," Soraka replied with a chuff. "It's been a while." "Indeed," the warrior replied. "My lord said you'd be in Khorstorofi Kerala somewhere, but it's always a horribly chaotic place. We feared we'd have to offer a bounty for information on your whereabouts." "That desperate to see me, eh?" Despite Soraka's good-humored reply, the warrior's laughter seemed forced. Did things take a dire turn on the Orgulan frontier? Or had the Yeti mounted a fresh offensive in the walled spine? "It's as I promised, isn't it?" The warrior's attention turned to Shawk's acquaintance, who shifted back at their sudden scrutiny. He glanced at the hunter beside him, who examined Shawk for a moment before nodding with a brusque grunt. The warrior fished a copper coin out of the purse tied to his belt and dropped it into the youth's paw. Rather than take his leave, Kaimali lingered and glanced between them. "You said something about a bounty. This brat." A silver coin joined the copper. Kaimali bobbed his head several times before turning to scurry away, coins clutched to his chest. "He's not your friend, I suppose?" Soraka asked. "I wouldn't call him that," Shawk answered. "You saw him when we first met, right? He's more like well, he tries to push me into being showier in the fighting pits. He said that it would bring in more money, but..." Shawk's voice trailed off. Her eyes went to the two Kira warriors. Anyway," she said, "why did you come for me? And how do you know Soraka?" "He visited our clanhold a few months ago," the Kira warrior replied. "As for why we're here, that's a discussion for a more private setting. If you don't mind." Silence fell between them. Soraka cleared his throat and gave Shawk a pointed look. "Oh," the young Osalo said. "Please, lead the way." As the Kira warriors led them through the city, Shawk fell in beside him. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" she asked in a low voice. "Because of the you-know-what?" Soraka chuckled lightly in response. "No," he said. "Your acquaintance's motives were clear enough. He received a finder's fee for locating warriors." With her life consumed by the efforts to restore the Pakan clan, Shawk was seeing things through a somewhat twisted lens. In a way, it was good to know that she was well and truly invested, but he hoped that Shawk would learn to look beyond her clan to the world at large while still keeping her people in mind at all times. "So," Jiraka said, "Shawk's worth a copper coin, but the lot of us are only worth a silver?" "It was an accidental finding," the Kira warrior replied hastily. "We meant no slight." "Warriors stink at pricing things anyway," Davy said lightly. "Remember that red dragon hide that Soraka picked up in Great Tier? And that box of hibernal quartz from the Obsidian Plain," Mitra added. "How would they even be able to get their hands on that, anyway? Then there was that chakram that he somehow convinced himself was the Sudarshana chakra," Karawaki said. "Oh, give me a break." His entourage burst into laughter. The Kira warriors seemed to relax, and they swiftly made their way to an old clanhold 2 valleys away from the Kuroko's cliffs. Like Shawk's ancestral home, it was in a state of utter ruin. At the center of the clanhold, they found the lord of the Kira clan standing at a brazier with several other unfamiliar lords. Those in attendance had formed a circle around the hold's central clearing, where 2 warriors were engaged in a bout. "Refilling the ranks?" Rana Saj turned at the sound of his voice. "Soraka." "I wasn't sure when you'd arrive," Soraka said. "How fare things in the east?" "The wet season's come in full force, so we just let the Yorgulans have the pass as planned. Our relief has assumed their station at Gorlia and they're closely monitoring the situation. So far, the Yorgulans haven't pressed their advance beyond the usual. The other parts of the front haven't reported any irregularities, either." Soraka made a sound deep in his throat. He couldn't say that it was a bad thing to have a reprieve from the Commonwealth's unexpected and devastating offensive, but, at the same time, it may have been another cunning move made by Rolengork's enemies. Rather than continuing their push, they may have chosen to let things cool off to encourage complacent thinking and lackluster preparations on Rolengork's part. "So you've been left to recover normally," Soraka said. Is that why you're looking for warriors? You mean this? He gestured to the ongoing bout. No, this is something else. Actually, it's a good thing we found you when we did. We were still deliberating over what to do in the east when dire word arrived from the west. Dire word, you mean from the Draconic Kingdom? Rana Saj nodded grimly. Soraka furrowed his brow. Despite everything else that was going on, Clan Torika still seemed to have things well in hand. Did the Black-Scaled Dragon Lord finally decide to act? What happened? Soraka asked. An undead army appeared, sweeping in from the northwest. Huh? That was exactly our reaction, Rana Saj replied dryly. A Conrunner barged into the council session for the Yorguland problem a few days ago and just dumped it on us. Seriously, what is Ranadratha doing? This was the last thing we needed. A call to arms, then? Indeed. A part of him stirred restlessly at the news. Soraka did not exult in warfare, but it still held an undeniable allure. He was a warmaster, after all. Wait a minute, Shork said. You're looking for warriors to fight the undead? We are, Rana Saj said. There is a great need for warriors who can perform martial arts. Who is this young lady? A warrior that we were led to, one of the Kiera clansmen said. We found Soraka with her by chance. Rana Saj gave Shork an appraising look. Well, since you've caught Soraka's eye, you must be something special. Her name is Shork, Soraka said. She's trying to rebuild her clan. In Kostorofi Keral, Rana Saj raised an eyebrow and chuckled. I think fighting the undead will be easier by far. We have a place for every warrior. Even the novices that we send can destroy skeletons and zombies, and that will free up our veterans for more powerful threats. What's the worst of what you're facing? Soraka asked. If it was an undead army, there would be at least an Elder Lich. That should have been a negligible issue for Clan Torika, so the Katsa Plains must have been home to a cabal. Elder Liches usually kept to themselves, however, so it was puzzling why they would leave their strongholds to invade the Draconic Kingdom. Furthermore, despite their intellect, their strategies and tactics were simple and predictably in line with their undead nature. They would be less an army and more a horde, though there may have been some basis for that distinction. The runner had few details, only names and descriptions for those without names. Numerous Elder Liches. There are other types, just as strong, but we don't know what they're called. What do they look like? Tall humanoid warriors, clad in spiked black plate armor with pulsing red veins. In one hand, they wield long, undulating swords that glow with a black light. In the other, they hold a tall tower shield. Death Knights, Soraka rubbed his jaw. No wonder you're looking for more warriors. Death Knights alone were not a problem for any country with a respectable military. The problem was the huge wave of zombies that came with them if they were allowed to rampage unchecked. Since they had come down through the civilian-occupied territories of the Draconic Kingdom, he wouldn't be surprised if there were millions of zombies in the undead forces. We'd love to hear more about them from you, Rana Saj said. It's reassuring to have someone of your experience to learn from. Learn from, huh? It sounds like they're still confident of victory. Well, I'd bet on them too if it was just a Death Knight. While the numbers were a real threat without sufficient coverage, the true problem was something else that Rana Saj's statements implied. Most Elder Liches weren't very strong. Elder Liches that had grown to be as strong as Death Knights, however, were close to becoming 6th-tier casters. In other words, Night Liches. It was even possible that some of the Elder Liches reported were in reality Night Liches, as they were outwardly identical in appearance and cared not for the trappings of mortals beyond their utility. A stray thought occurred to him. Were there any Solitas? What are those? Rana Saj asked. They look like skeletal horses, Soraka answered, wreathed in a sickly yellow-green mist. No, there wasn't anything reported resembling that. In hindsight, it was a stupid question. If a Solita had appeared, the resulting carnage would make it the very first thing that was mentioned. How is Clan Torika holding out? The undead tore through the civilian migrants, Rana Saj replied, but they've been stalled at the borders of Clan Torika's territory. There were a few fights involving around 10,000 undead each, but Ranadratha's forces handily destroyed them. If they're still asking for help, then there must be plenty more. It's difficult for their scouts to get a definitive count, Rana Saj said, but it only ever seems that more come. We need to do something about the undead while we still have them under control. That much Soraka could agree on. It was better to present a unified front against an existential threat than to suffer defeat in detail. He looked around at the gathered lords, most of whom were still evaluating the warriors demonstrating their skills. How many clans will be participating? Soraka asked. As many as we can afford, Ranasage answered. We need to maintain our border defenses, of course, but it will still be an army the likes of which Roland Gork has never seen. With those forces at the War Master's disposal, I dare say that our work will be done before the dry season returns.